Take a look at this image, and I'll start there with this quote from the Silmarillion. It is told that in the beginning the doors were made by Ale in the darkness of Middle Earth. For so greatly did Ale desire the coming of the children to have learners to whom he could teach his lore and his crafts, that he was unwilling to await the fulfillment of the designs of Iluvatar. And the voice of Iluvatar said to him, "Why hast thou done this?" Then Ale answered, "I desired things other than I am, to love and to teach them, so that they too might perceive the beauty of Ea, which thou hast caused to be. And in my impatience I have fallen into folly. Yet the making of things is in my heart from my own making by thee." So that's probably familiar to a lot of you who've looked at and thought about Tolkien and subcreation. But notice the idea of folly there. So I kind of wanted to ask the question, is when Tolkien strays into theology, is it folly, or are we getting theory, literary, theological? We'll find out today. So keep that in the back of your mind. But I want to start in 1954, right after the publication of the Fellowship of the Ring, when Tolkien received a letter from an enthusiastic local reader named Peter Hastings. And if anybody knows anything about Peter Hastings, please tell me at the end of this. I've looked everywhere I can for information about this guy. He was a manager of a Catholic bookshop in Oxford at the time, in September 1954. And Hastings' letter questions the theological orthodoxy of Tolkien. In a handful of instances, we think he saw draft and typescript manuscripts of the first two volumes, at least, of The Lord of the Rings. And in these, he questions whether it is orthodox to have, for instance, the book's Dark Lord Melkor creating orcs and trolls. Hastings also had a problem with the reincarnation of the elves, mentioned by Tolkien in a previous conversation they had, presumably in the bookshop. God has not used that device in any of the creations of which we have knowledge, argued Hastings. And it seems to me to be stepping beyond the position of sub-creator to produce reincarnation as an actual working thing. Because a sub-creator, when dealing with the relations between the creator and created, should use those channels which he knows the creator to have used already, the creator, right? I have, of course, already considered all the points that you raise, replies Tolkien, but to present my reflections to you would take a book. Tolkien says that several times in the letters, and then he writes very long letters. He probably should have just written the book instead. But that's what I want to get to. Why does he really present that kind of work to us ever in all of his writings? Or is he working these ideas out through his fiction? So Tolkien didn't write this book on subcreation theory and theology, and even this long epistolary replies to Hastings were not even sent, appearing to the public at least only after the first edition of his letters was published in 1981. So for my talk, I want to look closely at these letters and their context, because not only do we have Tolkien writing at length to a fellow Oxonian about his theory of subcreation, but we also see him responding to a fellow Catholic about points of theology. Many books have been written about how Tolkien's Middle-earth writings reflect various theologies: Catholic, Protestant, conservative, medieval, postmodern, the list goes on. And many more have been devoted to constructing literary theory from his fiction. And explaining his theory of literary subcreation to different audiences, however, was Tolkien himself conscious of doing literary criticism, or was he daring to produce formal theology? So first, some context about Hastings, at least that which I was able to find. So Peter Hastings, born 1922, passed away in 2012, was born actually in Kuala Lumpur, came here and read history at Worcester, at Oxford, before entering the Royal Navy during the Second World War. Shortly after his conversations with Tolkien, he began a teaching career, a long and distinguished teaching career, first in Uganda, then in Abingdon, and lastly in Leamington Spa, becoming the inaugural headmaster of Bishop Bright Grammar School in 1966, which was later amalgamated with Dormer High School in the 1970s to create a new comprehensive Trinity Catholic school, retiring in 1988. Hastings convinced the Dominicans in Oxford to provide Trinity with a full-time chaplain. And as a Catholic educator, he was actually rather famous, and his students wrote glowingly about his influence on their careers. He was, for example, an early champion of inquiry-based learning, to use some modern education jargon. And he talks about this in a book called Educating the Elephant's Child, which came out in 2010, just a couple years before he passed and passed away in Oxford, actually. Hastings was a liberal or progressive thinker drawn to the philosophy of Martin Buber and psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg's work on moral development, according to his obituary in The Guardian. And Hastings avoided catechisms, preferring to teach students theology as a rigorous academic subject, to the dismay of many conservative clergy that he worked with. One former student, Professor Jim Bright, describes Hastings as a radical reformer who eschewed hierarchies, formal titles, mandatory mass, and school uniforms, while celebrating high holy days at Trinity Catholic with rock music and dances. So you can imagine maybe he and Tolkien didn't see eye to eye in a lot of areas of culture and theology. I can't imagine Tolkien preferring a dance and a rock band concert to mass. I could be wrong. So after leaving the Navy then in 1946, Hastings returned to Oxford to study law, but left after only 2 terms to travel around France. He then opened this Catholic bookshop, opened first a Catholic bookshop in Dundee, in Scotland, only to discover, he says, that the Catholic population of Dundee bought few books, and still fewer Catholic ones. In 1950, Hastings returned to Oxford to run the Newman bookshop, named after now St. John Henry Newman. And that bookshop, as far as I can tell, had recently moved from Beaumont Street to Walton Street. Soon after this, he got married and he took an education diploma at Oxford. So he lived in and worked in and around the area, and his headhunting in Oxford, according to Guy in the obituary, was legendary. Hastings scoured the university for likely department heads for his school and interviewed candidates at the Turf Tavern. Those must have been fun interviews. So now let us look closely at the actual critique of Tolkien's theology, though this is supplied to us by Humphrey Carpenter in the introductory material to the letters, so keep that in mind. And specifically to letter number 153. So according to Carpenter, Hastings asked Tolkien whether he had perhaps overstepped the mark in metaphysical matters in his subcreation, and Hastings gave several examples of this. The first 2 were concerned with whether evil can create anything, and the examples he used were Treebeard's statement in The Two Towers that the Dark Lord had created the trolls and the orcs, or at least Treebeard remembers that to be the case. And the second example, that the troll William in The Hobbit expresses sympathy for Bilbo. Hastings suggested that evil was incapable of creating anything, comments Carpenter, and argued that even if it could create, its creatures, now he's quoting Hastings, could not have a tendency to good, even a very small tendency to good, like having sympathy. Hastings also objected to Goldberry's brief description of Tom Bombadil in The Fellowship. He is, right, saying that this implied that Bombadil was God, as well as Tolkien's inclusion of, as I mentioned, the reincarnation of elves. The Lord of the Rings, he says, is so good that it's a pity to deprive it of its reality by overstepping the bounds of a writer's job. Can you imagine telling Tolkien that? So not just questioning the theology, but questioning his connection as a writer of fiction to his understanding of theology in his own faith. So you can imagine Tolkien would have a lot to say in this. So now his response to Hastings, we see Tolkien being self-deprecating while at the same time asserting his authority as sub-creator of his secondary world. We see a writer still working out the implications of his now printed words, exploring theological concepts of great import, while also trying to define the role and responsibilities of an author subservient to the author of the universe. But before we look in detail at these responses to Hastings, it's also, I think, important to look at the context of Tolkien's life at the time. So the Fellowship was published, you recall, in August of 1954, and just a few days later, the first reviews began appearing, including C.S. Lewis's powerful, if over-enthusiastic, first review in Time and Tide. Edwin Meyer's review in The Observer agreed with Lewis that the novel, quote, describes a tremendous conflict between good and evil, but Tolkien's good people are consistently good, his evil figures immutably evil, and he has no room in his world for a Satan, both evil and tragic. He's got to be thinking Milton, right? So that's Meyer's review, his review of Fellowship. So Lewis would address this, I think, myopic criticism in his review of the second and third volumes of The Lord of the Rings. In September, Tolkien was still recovering after an illness from a summer trip to Ireland, during which he attended the centenary celebrations of the National University of Ireland in Dublin and received an honorary D.Litt from the university. In a letter to Catherine Ferrer that August, Tolkien complains, quote, "It has been and continues to be a crushingly laborious year. So many things at once, each needing exclusive attention." Singling out, in particular, his work on his translation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight for Allen and Unwin, and work on the appendices to The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien was also in the midst of proofs for The Two Towers, to be published in mid-November, and he was also trying to convince C.S. Lewis to take up the chair at Cambridge, which had virtually been created for C.S. Lewis, who turned it down twice, of course, and eventually accepted it. So that was a lot of work, talking to the other members of the committee at Cambridge. And while doing that, he was also preparing for a trip to Belgium in early October to receive yet another honorary doctorate, this one from the University of Liège. So Tolkien begins his response to Hastings, thanking him for his long letter, in which he paid me the compliment of taking me seriously. Perhaps too seriously, he says, and in the wrong direction. The tale is, after all, a tale, a piece of literature, intended to have literary effect, not real history. Hastings should wait for the appearance of the third volume, suggests Tolkien, before he makes these criticisms, not to mention on the more mythical histories of the cosmogony, first and second ages, i.e., what will become the Silmarillion. Since that whole matter, and I have this longer quote up there for you, since that whole matter from beginning to end, that matter, the Silmarillion, is concerned with the relation of creation to making and subcreation, and subsidiarily with the related matter of mortality, it must be clear that reference to these metaphysical things are not casual, but fundamental. They may be wrong from the point of view of reality, external reality, but they cannot be wrong inside his imaginary world, since that is how he made it. We differ entirely about the nature of the relation of subcreation to creation. So Tolkien asserting himself as the creator of this subcreated world. Tolkien says, for to depart from the channels that the creator is known to have used already is the fundamental function of subcreation, a tribute to the infinity of his potential variety. One of the ways in which it is indeed exhibited, as indeed he says the essay, meaning his essay on fairy stories, we'll get to in a minute. I'm not a metaphysician, he admits, but I should have thought it a curious metaphysic that declares the channels known to us to have been used are the only possible ones, or the only acceptable to and by the creator. So Tolkien perhaps modifies his first thoughts about the ability to create, for evil to create. The original Dark Lord, the rebellious Melkor or Morgoth, is said by Treebeard to have made monsters like trolls and orcs, but in counterfeit of pre-existing creatures, trolls, for example, being a counterfeit of Ents. Treebeard, of course, could be mistaken, Tolkien says, or orcs are ruined, for orcs are ruined, twisted, corrupted elves. So he's kind of got that wrong in his mind, Treebeard. As Frodo tells Sam in the Tower of Cirith Ungol, quote, the shadow that bred orcs can only mock, it cannot make, not real new things of its own. I don't think, says Frodo, that it gave life to the orcs. It only ruined them and twisted them. So is Tolkien here saying something extra textual about art in the primary world? Or at least about much of what passes as art and literature in the mid-20th century? Does this culture that he has rejected, does it mock because it cannot make? Even in our primary world, Tolkien muses in this letter, there may be, quote, some tolerated sub-creational counterfeits. It's a nice way of saying art I don't like, right? Art that doesn't fit his definition of sub-creation entirely. So in his long reply to his fellow Catholic, Tolkien takes seriously the charge that the theology of Middle-earth might not be consistent with the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. He answers Hastings' question of whose authority decides these things by writing that the immediate authorities are the Valar, the powers or authorities, the gods, if you will. But they are only created spirits themselves, of high angelic order, we should say, with their attendant lesser angels, reverend, therefore, but not worshipful. And though potentially subcreative and resident on earth, to which they are bound by love, having assisted in its making and ordering, they cannot by their own will alter any fundamental provision. So Melkor tries to do that before the creation of Ea, right? In the Song of Creation, he tries to alter, and Iluvatar keeps countering him and saying, we can do this all day. You're never going to be able to change my plan. So nothing's been created yet, but Melkor at least has tried to rebel in that way. Of course, when Tolkien is saying this, nobody knows who the Valar are. They will not appear for another 20 years in the form of publication of the Silmarillion. But nevertheless, Tolkien has clearly thought a lot about creation and subcreation in Middle-earth and how it relates to the creation and to his own subcreative urges. A footnote in this letter states, yes, a footnote in the letter. How many of you write footnotes in your letters? Tolkien does. Footnote in the letter says that this is why there are no temples or churches in Middle-earth. Its inhabitants, quote, had little or no religion in the sense of worship. For help they may call on the Vala, such as Elbereth, as a Catholic might on a saint, viewing the Valar as children view their parents, powerful yet subject to a king who does not live in their country, nor have any dwelling. I do not think, he says, that hobbits practice any form of worship or prayer, though the Númenóreans were pure monotheists, he says, whose only temple prior to Sauron's arrival there was the very top of their great mountain Minotarma, dedicated to Aru, to the One, both privately and publicly, invoked, praised, and adored. So Tolkien then asks the question, are there any bounds to a writer's job except those imposed by his own or her own finiteness. Think about that. Are there any rules that a writer has to play by as a sub-creator, the literary sub-creator? He answers his own question by saying, no bounds except for the laws of contradiction. I should think humility and an awareness of peril, though, is required of a writer. So no bounds. He's the sub-creator. He's the Lord and master thereof, of this world. But has to be careful not to contradict himself and should have this humility brought to the subject matter. So here, I think, are echoes perhaps of Augustine and Boethius, that no one can achieve true originality, but can only contradict the good and thus fall into evil. Tolkien again reminds Hastings that he is no trained theologian, but he can at least follow the thinking of Aquinas, he says, who was in turn following that of Aristotle, in creating characters whose actions cause us to reflect on virtue and vice. And another long quote here, I would claim, if I did not think it presumptuous in one so ill instructed, to have as one object of writing the elucidation of truth and the encouragement of good morals in the real world, by the ancient device of exemplifying them in unfamiliar embodiments that may tend to, quote, bring them home. Think of hobbits and elves and dwarves. But of course, I may be in error at some or all of these points. My truths may not be true, or they may be distorted, and the mirror I have made may be dim or cracked. I think there's so much possible meaning in these words. A mirror, dim or cracked, for example, could be alluding to both Paul's first letter to the Corinthians and to the Arthurian legend of the Lady of Shalott. And I admit that it was this quote that I felt had a justification for writing Hobbit virtues. Tolkien says, I'm doing virtue ethics. See, I'm doing virtue ethics. Is Tolkien, though, also thinking here of his friend C.S. Lewis attempting to elucidate truth in his own fiction, but perhaps presumptuously so in doing theology in his apologetics? So separating out what you can do in your fiction from sort of what you're trained to do as an academic. Great harm can be done, of course, by this potent mode of myth, he continues, especially willfully. The right to freedom of the sub-creator is no guarantee among fallen men that it will not be used as wickedly as his free will. To conclude, he says in this letter, having mentioned free will, I might say that in my myth I have used sub-creation in a special way to make visible and physical the effects of sin or misused free will by men. So on this myth, it is feigned that he gave special sub-creative powers to certain of his highest created beings, i.e. the Valar. That is a guarantee that what they devised and made should be given the reality of creation. Of course, within limits, and of course subject to certain commands or prohibitions. But if they fell, as the diabolus Morgoth did, and started making things for himself to be the Lord of those things, these would then be real physical realities and would be creatures begotten of sin and therefore naturally bad, but not irredeemably bad. That God would tolerate this bit of mischief seems no worse to Tolkien, no worse theology than the toleration of the calculated dehumanizing of men by tyrants that goes on today. That sounds a little like Lewis, doesn't it? A little like Lewis's cultural and political criticism. Well, we can compare the theology of the Hastings letter with another letter written to another Catholic, in fact, to a man who would be a Jesuit priest, his close friend Robert Murray, who was then in seminary. Murray seems, again, he got access early on to The Lord of the Rings, and it seems like he is also acquainted with Peter Hastings, because Tolkien writes to him, uh, as for Gandalf, surely it is not to join PH, i.e. Peter Hastings, to voice any criticism. We shouldn't be doing what Hastings just did. I could be much more destructive myself. I could destroy myself better than Hastings has. These are, I suppose, always defects in any large work of art, and especially in those of literary form that are founded on an earlier matter, which is put to new uses, like Homer or Beowulf or Virgil or Greek or Shakespearean tragedy. In which class, as a class, not as a competitor, The Lord of the Rings really falls. It is only founded on the author's own first draft. What is, in other words, if Virgil is founded on Homer, then the Silmarillion, The Lord of the Rings, everything is founded on a first draft by Tolkien himself. So it's kind of a little bit unfair to compare him as continuing epic in that way. For what it's worth, many years later, Father Murray, who recently some of these letters have been published, and interviews with Murray, Murray claimed that his own observations to Tolkien about The Lord of the Rings should not be taken, quote, to suggest that the novel contains theological statements, which nobody could have thought. That's Murray saying that. I don't think I would care to say more than, on one level, the values underlying Tolkien's imaginative works are Catholic in a rather medieval form. But I would subsume all theological evaluation under a literary appreciation of them as works of imagination inspired by ancient and medieval literature. That's Murray after Tolkien's death, reflecting. Tolkien concludes the letter to Hastings, now you will reasonably say, I am taking myself even more seriously than you did, making a great song and oration about a good tale, which admittedly owes its similitude to mere craft. It is so. Tolkien even writes at the top of the letter, not sent, for it seemed to be taking myself too importantly. He does this a couple times in the letters. I think this is important. Well, as for Hastings, he made a brief mention of Tolkien in his own book called Educating the Elephant's Child, written more than 50 years after his conversation with the professor. In a chapter discussing, quote, art as message, the title of the chapter, art as message in education, Hastings quotes, follow the line of connection here, quotes from the book of Daniel and from Dorothy Sayers, Dorothy Sayers, who's commenting on the portrait of Charlemagne in the Song of Roland. Did you follow that? So he gets to this kind of material. And it's all about the old man. It's about the white of hair and beard, God's vice regent, the father of Christendom, the earthly image of the ancient days from the book of Daniel. And this is now Hastings here. The picture of the trappings of old age as a representation of strength and wisdom has survived in literature to our own time. In George MacDonald's, for example, in George MacDonald's picture of Irene's grandmother in The Princess and the Goblin, and in Tolkien's portrait of Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings. And that's all he says about Tolkien in the book. But is it still there in the mass of mind sufficiently to sustain the notion of power and mind in the picture of the Ancient of Days? Since God cannot be pictured, we should move on now in our symbolism if we can. But if so, to what? Symbolism of the Ancient of Days. Hastings, right elsewhere in the book, quotes G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis, so we're in very familiar territory here. But he never mentions this conversation with Tolkien, as far as I know. In the book, he doesn't mention it. The point, though, that he's making in this passage seems to be that we should move on from our ancient and outdated image of God as the wise old man. But, on the other hand, he offers no insight into a replacement of this image. Quote, art in the school was a language for exploration, for conveying views and for expressing judgments, another language for the individual exploration of his or her own distinct journey, and through which there can be varied and exciting communication with others. Art and language, as defined by Peter Hastings. So I think Tolkien and Hastings would have agreed with Hastings on that definition, I think, of art, of subcreation, if you will, that art is another language. But without widespread recognition of symbols like the wise old man or woman, would such a language be intelligible? If Gandalf is depicted by Tolkien can connect us through Charlemagne or Arthur or Merlin to God as the enthroned Ancient of Days in the book of Daniel, then Tolkien as sub-creator has successfully used his art to convey his message to individuals who then can embark on their own individual journeys, some of whom will themselves become sub-creators. For example, many of the fantasy writers who write in imitation or an inspiration from Tolkien. Hastings may not have been entirely comfortable with the image of the stern old judge, but Tolkien deemed it important to continue both the image and the theological message. Witness Gandalf's nuanced judgment of Gollum in his long conversation with Frodo at the beginning of the Fellowship, and especially, I think, in the judgment of Baragon by the newly crowned Aragorn at the end of the Return of the King. Baragon, you recall, is sent into exile by Aragorn, but with a promotion as his punishment for disobeying the orders of Denethor. And Aragorn Tolkien narrates, and then Baragon, perceiving the mercy and justice of the king, Aragorn, was glad and kneeling kissed his hand and departed in joy and content. So these images, I think, of chivalry and kingship and the wise judgment of Aragorn as king that we don't really get at all in the movies, I think are really important in The Return of the King, especially the medievalists. We love all of the heraldry. So taking a lot of that stuff out and the feudal ceremonies and so on weakens it from a medievalist perspective. But I think that is essential for Aragorn to assume these different qualities of kingship that Tolkien is linking, like Dorothy Sayers, back ultimately to the Ancient of Days. Well, of course, in September 1954 was not the first time that Tolkien had given extensive thought to the subject of subcreation. Tolkien's concept of subcreation, I think, can be traced back at least, if not earlier, at least to the early 1930s and to his famous, though delayed publication of the poem Mythopoeia, which was a result of his famous late-night conversation with C.S. Lewis and Hugo Dyson here at Magdalen College in September 1931. So this is eventually the result of that. Responding to Lewis's assertion on that walk and talk that myths were lies and therefore worthless, even though they were breathed through silver, great Lewis line. Tolkien's narrator, who's Philomythos, corrects Mesomythos, Philomythos, the myth lover, correcting the myth hater. And I won't quote all of that passage there, but I want to point out in here that we get man as sub-creator, as a refracted light through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues. So like Sauron, the white is splintered into Sauron of the many colors. But the end, this excerpt at least, we see the rhyme that 'twas our right to do this creation of elves and goblins and so on, used or misused. The right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we're made. So again, if he's thinking about subcreation, theorizing about subcreation, it's not in his nonfiction that it first appears. It's in this case, a poem. I think that's important. So this is also this passage here about having to defend the subcreation is also Alle's argument from the first slide, right? Ale is threatened with punishment from the Iluvatar for creating the dwarves too early. And he says, I'm sorry, I did it because you made me. And I'm doing it as a reflection of your own creation. This reflective response, this idea that the creator makes little creators, I think is an interesting one. One thinks of Adam naming the animals in Eden, of the Prometheus myth, of Aquinas's doctrine of participation in creation, and of Dante's elevation of poets in the Divine Comedy. George MacDonald, whose myth-making abilities both Tolkien and Lewis admired, discusses the theological dimension of artistic creation in his own literary criticism back in the 1880s. As Clive Tolley has pointed out, Tolkien may also have been influenced by Philip Sidney's famous argument in defense of Poesy in 1595 that by imagination, man can create new worlds. In the Quintus Silmarillion episode of the creation of the dwarves, Ale the Vala is both sub-creator and teacher, remember. He's teaching the dwarves the art of making things, right? Valar are among those powers or rulers, rational spirits of mind without rational spirits or minds without incarnation, as Tolkien wrote to a reader of The Lord of the Rings in 1958, who took part in the making of the world as sub-creators. So now he's explaining the creation story that he has written in various forms but not published yet to people who haven't seen it yet. So really, as Verlin Flieger and Ralph Wood have both pointed out, the Valar are the equivalents of the angelic beings who are God's partners or assistants in creation in the book of Genesis. Whether Tolkien is here being Neoplatonic, as Flieger suggests, or Thomist, as American theologian Jonathan McIntosh argues, is a matter for which, of course, we don't have time to settle that issue, but we could also throw in Johannine theology, that of Augustine, Boethius, Erigena, Bonaventura. Many people have looked for the specific theologies for which Tolkien is perhaps drawing, mainly through his fiction. So I want to now turn to the nonfiction and just briefly look at the key works. And of course, probably the most important is his essay on fairy stories, which he alludes to in these letters, given in 1939 at St. Andrews, but published first in Essays Presented to Charles Williams in 1947. So this long essay in which he's doing everything but defining fairy stories, frankly, right? Everything he can to not give us an actual definition of fairy stories. He does give us this theory about subcreation and these forms of fantasy, escape, recovery, escape, and consolation. So he's talking through a lot of the sub-creative issues here in the essay. In fantasy, he says, we escape the primary world and enter a secondary world through enchantment, which he calls an elvish craft, the desire for a living, realized, sub-creative art, wholly different from the greed or self-centered power, which is the mark of the mere magician. So that distinguishing what the elves do in their creation and healing magic versus what the magic and machines of the Saurons and the Saurons are doing. That's a very important distinction for Tolkien. We make in our measure and in our derivative mode because, again, we are made. Now, in the epilogue to the essay, he dedicated more to the consideration of the concept of joy. And Tolkien writes that every sub-creator wishes in some measure to be a real maker, that in successful fantasy, joy is a sudden glimpse of the underlying reality of truth, not only a consolation of the sorrow of this world, but a satisfaction, a far-off gleam or echo of evangelium in the real world. And those of you who read the essay know famously that he ends with basically the gospel, the birth, crucifixion, resurrection of Jesus. And so I give to you this image here is a statue by Frederick Hart, who's a Washington, D.C. sculptor who sculpted the tympanum of the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. So if you've ever gone into, I think it's our largest cathedral in the U.S., you'll see his work of creation there. He also has a statue at the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. I didn't know him, but I got to meet his wife, and who was his model for many works. And she described this work as the only, at the time, he created this for John Paul II, Pope John Paul II, is the only sculpture in this acrylic lit sculpture that captured the incarnation, the crucifixion, and the resurrection all within one static sculpture. And if you look at it from different angles, I think you can see that. So we have the nonfiction theory there. Then we go back to fiction, to allegory, and famously in Leaf by Nigel, we have Tolkien providing us with a little artist who never finishes his job, never finishes his work, right? And Tolkien himself alludes in a letter in 1957 to Leaf by Nigel, for you should go there, he says, to see subcreation, because it arose from my own preoccupations with the Lord of the Rings, the knowledge that it would be completed in great detail. The novel would eventually get completed in great detail, or not at all. And the fear, near certainty, that it would be not at all. And that's very much Tolkien's temperament, right? Lewis says you can influence him rather easily, or he'll change everything he does to correct for your suggestion, or he'll ignore you completely, right? It's kind of that either or. And he says that, this has been in his mind, and this fear, because it's a fear in the time of war. The war has risen to darken all horizons. And here he's talking about the Second World War, having nearly been killed in the first, as Tolkien himself, in the introduction to Leaf by Nigel and On Fair Stories, says it's both touching in different ways on what is called in the essay subcreation. And we see this in other letters. I won't read these long quotes from the Milton Waldman letter, one of his longest and most famous letters, where he's trying to get The Lord of the Rings published with the London publisher Collins. And he's explaining his process of the creation of The Lord of the Rings, but also the Silmarillion, because he's trying to publish them all together, which, of course, they didn't want to do. Nobody wanted to do. But he talks, I think, a lot there about subcreation. And to wrap things up here, I think importantly in the comments in all these letters, we have the fall that precedes the fall precedes the creation of the world, theologically for Tolkien. It precedes Ea. Ea has in it, therefore, subcreatively introduced evil, rebellions, discordant elements of its own nature already, he says, when the Let It Be was spoken. Biblical Let It Be, not the Beatles album. Let It Be. Such a primeval introduction of evil would likely not have convinced Peter Hastings, nor would it be very attractive to Enlightenment liberals or modern political progressives. But I think that C.S. Lewis, who was never really a mesoethos, even before the walk, right, did give us his versions of this rebellious and power-hungry subcreators, I think, in Weston, in the Space Trilogy, in Uncle Andrew, in The White Witch, and in The Tyrants in The Abolition of Man, who turn to magic and machine for solutions. Tolkien talks of progressive apes in Mythopoeia, whereas Lewis talks of trousered apes in The Abolition of Man. And I think they're talking about a similar type of tyrant. If Tolkien is using myth, including his own literary subcreations, to do metaphysical speculation or even speculative theology, he is aware of his own lack of training in the area. Lewis's early philosophical training as a Platonist gives him at least credentials to do formal metaphysics. But while Tolkien's respect for the auctoritas of the Catechism of the Catholic Church may have kept his theological speculations in check, Lewis could wonder and wunder further afield, even to the point of playing with discarded heresies. Similarly, Lewis could attempt broad literary theory or criticism, like in Experiment in Criticism in 1961, which is partly an attempt to attack what literary criticism had become, while Tolkien stuck mostly to close readings of primary texts and to genres like fairy stories. His bona fides are in philology and translation, and they're solid. But I think it also fits his temperament more. So I'll conclude with give you a little bit of this quote from the C.S. Lewis review here. Speculation about the nature of God, the nature of man, the nature of nature. Tolkien found that producing his own myths and fairy stories was simply more enjoyable to do that kind of speculation, more fulfilling than to produce formal theory. Lewis writes in his first review of The Lord of the Rings that Tolkien's novel is one of the most radical acts of subcreation in modern literature, hitting us like lightning out of a clear blue sky, filled with moments of beauty which pierce like swords or burn like cold iron. This is good news, good beyond hope, Lewis writes, and good enough for most of us, perhaps better than we deserve. Thank you.